The Philanthropist, Monday, March 16th, 1795, London. Printed for and sold by Daniel Isaac Eaton, printer and bookseller to the Supreme Majesty of the People, at the Cock and Swine, number 74, Newgate Street, 1795. Price 1 penny. I would make you think well of yourself. I would raise your hope. I would rouse your ambition. I would shake off your national ennui and develop the germs of genius, of virtue, and of public glory. There is not a tenant of the meanest hovel in whom I do not recognize the capability and sovereignty of his nature, through all its degradation, and the veriest wretch over whom I stumble in the street I deplore as the remote but the well-connected consequence of an absurd political constitution. Drennan's letter to Earl Fitzwilliam. Talent was conferred on mankind, undoubtedly, for the promotion of public virtue and the enlargement of human felicity. It never could have been the divine intention that its energies should be coerced, its exertions impeded, or that its radiance should be obscured in darkness and in night. No, so sublime a blessing must have been bestowed on man for purposes more exalted in their object and more consoling to human reason itself. It must have been bestowed on him to inspire him with a sense of the dignity which he sustained in the creation, to teach him the duties which were due from him to his God, to himself, and to his species, and thus, by awakening within him all those benevolent sympathies and affections which animate to philanthropy and to generous action, to bind him to his fellow creatures in social charities and in endearing intercourse. Such can we discover from his designs and disposition to have been the will of our common parent. And happy would it have been for the felicity as well as for the character of human nature, if that merciful inclination had never been counteracted. But experience obliges us to acknowledge the melancholy truth that we ourselves have oftentimes defeated it. By neglecting to cherish one blessing, we have lost every other that could beautify and endear us the possession of life. For directing our eyes back to a review of past events, and beholding human existence at different periods in its diversified forms and appearances, what do we contemplate but one crowded picture of the most frightful groups and disgusting assemblages that the most lively imagination can conceive? What but a most lamentable yet real exhibition of our fellow creatures sunken almost beneath the lowest condition of degradation and abasement, alternately the victim of the craft of princes and of priests, and frequently of both of them together, at one time terrified by the anathemas of a persecuting superstition into the most abject submission, at another scourged almost beyond the patience of the meanest servitude by the scorpion thong of imperious and unrelenting despotism. What a gloomy portrait, too, is presented to us of the human mind. We behold the understanding, the genius, and the intellect of man prostrated, as it were, before the shrine of the most abominable idols. We behold every faculty of the soul enchained, its best power either totally annihilated or perverted to promote the despicable views of power, rapacity, and ambition, a night of ignorance overwhelming her empire, and chasing away every ray of wisdom, of science, of public or of private virtue. When I read in the insults and the indignities man has dared to heap on man only because fortune had placed him on a throne, when I read of the enormities, the cool, deliberate enormities which have been perpetrated against the peace and tranquillity of society, when I read of the innocent blood that has been spilled to satiate the thirst of restless and sanguinely ambition, and when, worst and most dreadful of, I read of the tyrannies which have been exercised over the human mind itself, I vow to God I know not whether I ought the more to commiserate the fortune of a people depressed and enslaved beneath the fetters of ignorance, or to execrate the remorseful authors of their afflictions, their sufferings, and their persecutions. It must be acknowledged, however, from these gloomy pages of our history, one important instruction is to be collected. From every evil, something to our advantage is to be extracted, and this instruction has surely been purchased at too high a price, not to be attended to with earnestness, and is of itself too valuable not to be engraved on the heart of every Englishman who reveres the independence of his country. The instruction is, tyranny is ever the inseparable attendant of ignorance, and that a nation which aspires to the enjoyment of that charter, which heaven has given it in all the perfections of liberty, must be enlightened and informed. Impressed sincerely and deeply as I am with the conviction of this eternal and immutable truth, it is impossible that I, an advert to a favorable sentiment which I know obtains among a number of persons, without abhorrence and without indignation. There are many who persuade themselves, and who, too, persuade others, that the majesty of science should never condescend to visit the house of the poor man. They tell us that learning has a natural tendency to make the mind discontented with its situation, and that it inspires desires incompatible with the low habits of hard and laborious industry, that to give the lower classes of the community a relish for literature is not only doing an injury to them, but also to society, since it makes them more sensible and alive to their wrongs and misfortunes, without meliorating their lot, and since it deprives the public of the fruits of their toil by impelling them to other pursuits and superior attainments. They quote the reflection of Gray in one of his beautiful odes: "Since ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise." But these reasons are as disgraceful as they are untrue. They cannot be approved by humanity, nor can they be confirmed by the approbation of its judgment. They are a libel on man and on his Creator. They pollute the lips which utter them, and show the heart from whence they flow, not only to be unacquainted with human nature and the human disposition, but also to be little, sordid, and contracted. But to these enemies, to these species, for so I must consider them, let it be conceded that the diffusion of science and knowledge would be accompanied with the inconveniences of which they are apprehensive, and for the prevention of which they prescribe their bounds to the advancement of human improvement. I would ask them, though they might be able to reconcile their uncharitable disposition of their own consciences, I would ask them if they are capable of reflecting at all. How criminal must they consider themselves in the eyes of heaven, and what shame and remorse ought they to feel when they recollect that they have been acting in defiance to the will of the Almighty by impeding the progress of one of his noblest works, and by confining those blessings which he intended should be communicated to all his creatures within bounds so scanty in themselves and so hostile to the real happiness and interests of so many thousands of the human race. Let therefore these unfeeling misanthropes cease to impose upon themselves and upon others. Rather, let them contemplate their own real condition. Let them ask themselves what powers they possess in contributing to the weal of the community. Then let them compare their condition and powers with the condition and powers of those whom they treat with contumely and with insult, and whom they would have precluded from enjoying the privileges of their nature. What are they themselves? Can they turn one furrow of the soil, or do they know how to scatter one seed upon the earth? Can they of themselves procure either the provisions that are to feed them, or the raiment which is to clothe them? What pretensions then have such men, who, like the infant, depends on others for protection, and even for the enjoyment of life itself? What pretensions have they to arrogate themselves so much importance in the creation as to monopolize the best and perhaps only real means of happiness that Providence have sent into the earth? Should there be no return made for the sweat which is drained from the brow of the poor labourer, who, after his daily toil is over, is but half paid for his work and services, it is indeed a very gross mistake to believe that the rich man maintains the poor. The case is the reverse. It is the poor man that maintains the rich, for it is not the estate, it is the labour which is expended on it, which furnishes the luxuries of his table, and enables him to keep up the splendour of his equipage. Which, then, is the dearer object of our interests, the labour which produces the fruits and necessaries of life, or the profusion and imprudence which waste and lavish them away? Permit, ye lower orders of society, but not the less valuable, because ye fill the humble station, permit the philanthropist, whose labours are dedicated to you, to address you in the eloquent and benevolent manner in which a writer has lately addressed his own countrymen. O people, created always in the extreme, as majesty or as a mob, worshipped in the abstract with solemn mockery, abused in the detail with wanton scurrility, thou common toast and tool of pensioners and patriots, like the earth on which you tread, denied as dirt, though the great pabulum of luxury and enjoyment. Let me never outrage your wretchedness by base allusion and camellious comparison, and by the estimation set upon you, sink you still lower in the self-estimation which is the spring of good character, and by vilifying and scandalizing your character, make you gloomily acquiesce to the calumny, and thus drive you to abandonment and despair. No, I would make you think well of yourself. I would raise your hope. I would rouse your ambition. I would shake off your national ennui and develop the germs of genius, of virtue, and of public glory. There is not a tenant of the meanest hovel in whom I do not recognize the capability and sovereignty of his nature through all its degradation, and the veriest wretch over whom I stumble in the street I deplore as the remote but well-connected consequence of an absurd political constitution. It is impossible that anyone can look at the situation of the poor of this country without emotions of a very painful and agonizing nature. The children of fortune and of affluence have seldom leisure or inclination to contemplate so melancholy a picture, having never tasted themselves of the poisoned bowl of penury. They cannot feel for distresses with which they are unacquainted, nor can they commiserate the sigh which, because they have never heaved, they believe to be feigned or hypocritical. They read of the afflictions of their fellow creatures as they would amuse themselves with a tale or a romance, and they pity the unfriended child of want, perishing for a morsel of bread, as they would pity the desponding and lovelorn hero of the piece, or the unfortunate virgin confined by necromancy in some enchanted castle. But there are some hearts made to sympathize with those that suffer. To some minds it is pleasing, though melancholy office, to leave the sunshine of prosperity, to view a while amid the gloom of hard necessity and want, the scene of wretchedness in which thousands of their race are engaged, It were an easy task here to awaken the compassion of benevolent souls by enumerating the miseries of hunger, thirst, cold, nakedness, pain, and sickness. But these perhaps are the lightest hardships which attend the abandoned and neglected children of poverty. In what language and with what sentiments shall I speak of that state to which their mind and every active energy of their nature are consigned? Instead of being taught the duties from whence are to flow all the comforts of life, they are either initiated in the docility of infant years in the arts of villainy, and are trained up for the habits of dishonesty, or they are turned upon the world with no advantage to assist them, and with no guide to direct them in their path, to make their own fortunes, and to provide for their own subsistence. Who can be surprised, then, that such wretches should be hurried into deeds of guilt and wickedness, and that at length their minds debauched and rendered callous by a long course of crimes, they should be doomed to expiate their guilt at the tree of ignominy? It is therefore from an ardent wish to do good and to apply his humble talents to the best purposes that the philanthropist begins his career. To the people whom he considers his fellow creatures and his brethren he dedicates his feeble efforts. He wishes to see them happy and enlightened and in the possession of every blessing and of every liberty that are the birthright of human beings. But to be thus happy and free, he bids them remember that their minds must be illumined, and that the darkness of ignorance must be chased away. Their minds must be weaned from vice and formed for virtuous action. This is the province for knowledge to accomplish. To instruct the mind is to prepare it for the important task it has to perform on the theatre of life. May then science be widely fostered in this kingdom. May education be everywhere patronized and promoted. May poverty be deprived of her bitterest scourge and her sharpest afflictions, and may all her children be restored to the dignity of that rank for which they were ordained by heaven, but from which they have been debarred from the cruelty of their lot. We conclude the first number of The Philanthropist with the following beautiful address to poverty. "'Tis not that look of anguish bathed in tears, O poverty, thy haggard image wears. 'Tis not those famished limbs, naked and bare to the black tempest rains, or the keen air of winter's piercing winds, nor that sad eye imploring the small boon of charity. 'Tis not that voice whose melancholy tale might turn their purple cheek of grandeur pale, nor all that host of woes thou bring'st with thee, insult, contempt, disdain, and contumely, that bid me to call the lot of those forlorn, who 'neath thy rude oppressing sigh and mourn. But chief, relentless power, thy hard control, that to the earth bends low the aspiring soul, thine iron grasp, thy fetters drear, which bind each generous effort of the struggling mind. Alas, that genius melancholy flower, scarce opening yet to even's nurturing shower, should, by thy pitiless and cruel doom, wither, and nature marks her smiling bloom, that innocence touched by thy deadening wand should pine, nor know one outstretched guardian hand. For this, O poverty, for them I sigh, the hapless victims of thy tyranny. For this I call the lot of those severe, who wander mid thy haunts and pine unheeded there.